Hey friends, welcome back to Belle's Library. I have just finished reading this book. It's called Time and Again by Jack Finney. If you're not familiar with this title, maybe you have heard of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He wrote a book called The Body Snatchers in the 50s. It was made into several movies afterward. It's kind of one of those cult classics for sci-fi fans. And it all originated with this guy, Jack Finney. So this is the second or third time that I've read through Time and Again. It has a sequel. In fact, I think it might have two sequels, but one at least, called From Time to Time. And then there's another book that has a similar cover called About Time, but I think that might be a set of short stories regarding time travel. I'm not sure. Anyway, I wanted to actually make a whole video on this book. I'm not going to give any spoilers that you couldn't find just by reading the back of the book, but I just kind of want to talk about how this book really affected me. This was kind of like reading a time capsule. I know there's a lot of time travel stories out there, but this book is like a time capsule. So especially if you are familiar with New York or if you live in New York, but if you've been there and you've been sightseeing, which I have not, you will just really get a lot more out of this book than even I did, and I got a lot out of it. So the story revolves around Cy Morley, who is a illustrator for a newspaper or magazine, I believe. And he is approached by some people who are from the government and other places, just kind of this little organization of people who have been doing experiments in time travel. And they have been setting up scenarios of different time periods, trying to get people kind of acclimated to those scenarios. And then the purpose is to send them into, the past to sort of walk out these scenarios and see how close they were, how much of our history has been, removed, or how much is the same, and but try not to affect anything, right? So this guy Cy, he fits all of their qualifications, and so he is trained and ends up getting himself back into the 1880s. And the way he does it, I think I would have liked kind of a better system for time travel for Cy. But the book, I should actually mention before I go too far into this, was published in the late 60s. So the copy I have has copyright of 1970s, and the when he is in present day, it is that present day. So the guy travels from the late 60s to the 1880s, and he actually makes a few trips back and forth. And each time he affects history a little bit more, but when he gets back to the present day, they run all these tests and they have him list out hours worth of things that are facts to him so that they can see if they can catch anything that is misconstrued, and that's their way of sort of detecting if he has changed anything in history. Like if he mentions people that he knew in places that he's gone, people that were president, and food that is popular, or commercials or whatever, and then all of a sudden he says something and it red flags and they're like, oh, that's not part of our reality. Then they know he has somehow, some way changed history. Or somebody else has, right? If there was another time traveler that had been successfully sent out. So far, Cy is their most successful time traveler. So he goes back and forth, does certain things, and each time he has more and more of an impact on his life that he's starting to build in the 1880s. And it seems like he would be actually affecting the present day, but every time he comes back, it doesn't seem that anything has been done. And so the idea is that, well, maybe it's not so temperamental as we think, and maybe we actually can do quite a bit in that time period without affecting current times. So the book ends really well, and it actually ends with the promise of a sequel. And so, like I said, there is that sequel that I am just wishing I had right now, because when I picked this up, forgot that it was the first of two, and all the bookstores are closed because it's New Year's and I have plans, so I can't leave anyway to go find a copy. I'm just gonna have to suffer for a few days, I think, until I can get one ordered. But I took quite a bit of annotations down. I also have started, if you guys have watched my New Year's goal video, I don't even know if I've put it up by the time I put this up. I think I'm going to put that one up today. But anyway, I've been using these little books that my husband made for writing out my book journal notes rather than just taking notes on my phone is kind of one of my New Year's resolutions. But he made these lovely little bound books. He's been teaching himself bookbinding, and so he is hoping to put them up for sale, but I'd be just as happy if he just gave them all to me for my book notes. But anyway, I wanted to share some of the things that really stuck out to me in this book because I think it is a really important story. Like I said, it's kind of a time capsule sort of story, but also for me, it was almost like I could time travel in this book as well. But I wasn't time traveling just to the 1880s with Cy. I, as a person living in 2023, was time traveling to the late 60s, early 70s, because so much of the things that this writer mentioned as being current things in the late 60s are now not a thing anymore, or the timeline has been affected in a different way than he thought it would be. And so I have notes all throughout my book kind of giving updates, and I'll share some of that with you guys. But something real quick I want to note before I go further. Oh, there's so much to say. The way that this author just describes things, the way he describes Cy's exuberance when he sees something in 1882 that, is also in his own present day timeline. And he gets so excited, and just the feelings he has and the things that he says, and almost just kind of a vulnerable sort of way that he's acting, you feel that. Like, you feel that you are Cy, and you feel his excitement. The descriptions of things, the way people think, they're things that you wouldn't actually think of until the guy points it out in his writing, and you're like, oh yeah, you're right, I probably would have done that thing. It's hard to explain. You'll see when you read it. But for instance, there's at one point, I did mention this in the marathon video that I did when I was reading this, but at one point he's playing a game with a girl that he's walking with downtown, and they're looking at like ladies' gloves in the window, and he's so surprised that one glove has 12 buttons. And he's like, 12 buttons? And she's like, yeah, so? And then she's like, that one has 15. And so then he counts, well, that one has 20. And then she says, well, that one has 21. And then he counts, and he's like, well, that one has 22. I win. And they just like laugh about and keep walking. And it's just kind of one of those things. Like, we think about what the Victorians would have worn kind of on a grand scale, but do we think about the fact that there was various amounts of buttons on the gloves? Like, I might be thinking that if I'm involved in, one of my reenactment, events or something. But just on the everyday, I'm thinking of that particular piece of clothing in a more broader sense. But to think of actually making a game of counting the buttons, it was like this author could really put himself back in that time of history and what would the people do. And he does that all throughout. And I think that's one of the reasons why I loved this so much and why I did take a really long time reading. I read it very slowly. I read most of it over the course of a day, but it was a day of like 18 hours, right? So it shouldn't have taken me that long to read 400 pages. But I was just really sort of consuming this story, and I would take the time to stop and look up things and research and write notes. And anyway, it was a whole experience reading this book. You don't often find something like that, right? Where it's just an immersive experience. Anyway, I don't, of finding a book that is immersive like that, especially with all of the things that I have going on in my life. I'm so busy. I have lots of children. I have lots of things going on. I have lots on my schedule each day. So to find a story that I can completely immerse myself in, that was a treat. I really enjoyed it. Another thing I really appreciated in this story that I didn't really actually pick up on until almost to the end of the story was how the women are portrayed. They are all portrayed as intelligent, as capable. The 1880s women are portrayed as just as intelligent and capable and, not naive, not ignorant as the modern day women. This author, you can tell, respects women, or at least respected them in this story. As there are some time traveling women in the story, and as they are going back and forth on various timelines, they are not shocked to the point of fainting and, oh, I can't handle this sort of a behavior. It's more of a surprise and an awe, and they are coming to a lot of the conclusions rather than always being the guy, right? Now, I'm not one of those that tends to pick out a lot of male dominance in stories. That's not a theme that I'm really aware of. Not that it's, not an important issue, but I also tend to feel like I'm putting things in their historical context pretty well, and I think maybe that's why it stood out to me so much, that in these eras of history mentioned, these women were held to a standard of intelligence and of critical thinking and problem solving and emotional stability and all those things like we want them to be, right? So I really enjoyed that. The guy didn't have any crazy affairs. There was no, his buddies might have talked, kind of like we hate women being talked about, but this main character himself, there wasn't really any of that. I appreciated that. So now I'm going to go into a few specifics from the story, and I will be reading specific lines. I don't think it's going to give away anything of the actual plot or storyline or spoiler type things, but if you don't want to hear this part, you'll probably want to turn off the video at this point. Otherwise, I just wanted to point out a few things that I thought were so interesting and just gave me such a good, feeling. Just one of those things that really made this, I don't know if I want to say it's a cozy read, but it was just a heartwarming, it was just a satisfying, like if you had some kind of a really hearty, meaty, warm, gravy-ish dinner. That's kind of how reading this book sort of was. So there's a lot of photography and drawing throughout the story. Some of it, I think, are photographs that he was able to take because he either got them from a source that owned them, or they were a matter of public record sort of a thing. But he uses a lot of these when he's talking about how the buildings in the 1880s are almost exactly like the buildings in the 1970s, these specific buildings, right? Like, oh, that building is still standing, and that building. That's why I'm saying if you are a New Yorker or familiar with New York, that this book will probably really appeal to you and and just be one of those really special books, because it's talking about places that people are familiar with, right, who are familiar with New York. So anyway, a lot of times I would then take the time and stop and look it up and see, oh, is that building still standing now? And then I would make a little mark like that, still standing in 2023. Because it's interesting to me, right? All of this history still there. So that was a cool part of it. And then there was a lot of opportunities to just search out historical facts. So when the guy goes back to the 1880s, he sees the line of the Hack Line, which was a line of horse-drawn carriages near Central Park. And I'm assuming that they took people on carriage rides around the park, but my husband said they were probably taxis as well. And so he mentions that, and he's excited, like, there's the Hack Line where they've been ever since, at the 59th Street curb beside the park. They've been there ever since, is what he says. And so I was like, well, what is this Hack Line, and is it still there? So then I found a couple of articles. Yes, the horse-drawn carriages are still at Central Park. And in 2019, this special interest group that was concerned, or has been concerned, for the welfare of the horses, were able to, make a big deal and got it so that the horses now are parked inside the park rather than being along the street, because that is a safer breathing environment for them without having to bring all that exhaust all day long. And then also safer so that they're not getting spooked as easily by all of the traffic and the crazy stuff going on. And so apparently now they are lined up inside the park, and the same group is trying to have further restrictions on like how long they can be out in the heat, or how hot it has to get before they can be brought inside, and then eventually to get rid of the whole tradition. And again, because it's a tradition, that might take some time, but it's interesting, right? Because that is still a relevant part of history. The book opens my eyes to some things that I didn't realize were a thing, and just kind of made me think about things that I hadn't really thought about before, like how noisy the streets would be with all of those iron-covered wheels and the iron on the horses' hooves, and all of the yelling, from the different people yelling at their horses or yelling across the street, or, eventually streetcars and all these things. That's probably very noisy, just as noisy as it is now, just different noises. Another thing talked about how the time zones weren't a thing. And so you may be a different time in just the next town over from you. And a few states over, it might be hours different than where you're at, which is the case, I guess, in the world now as our world is broken up into different time zones. But this was a much more varied time zone. Like I said, within your county, you could have 4 or 5 different exact times. And so it showed how New York had the pole with a ball that would come down at exactly noon, so everybody could stand there and set their watches to that. That's something I would like to look up and look into a little bit more of how that whole thing worked. And then at the very end of the story, the discussion is this a good idea? Is time travel and the potential of affecting a timeline, is this a good idea? Is this the right thing to do? Do we have any business doing this? And some of the characters conclude that no, we do not have any business doing this. And some of the characters conclude we may have no business doing this, but we're going to still do it. And so there are parallels drawn between things like the bombs dropped on Japan, things like the draft, things that were questionable and controversial, and we still talk about and think about, right, just in other ways. Now we have conversations about vaccines, and we have conversations about different ways of educating your children. We have different conversations about what sort of things are just acceptable in society. There's all kinds of conversations. Just makes you think, right, about if just because we can, does that mean that we should? Really, I think is the overall question. Just because we have the ability or the technology or the right or the freedom, does it mean it's the right thing to do? And so that question is addressed and answered by the characters that, matter to us in the story. And then a sequel is hinted at. So I thought this was a super fantastic book. It was definitely worth the time that I put into reading and just studying it, researching it. Again, like I said before, it's not so much a time travel novel as it is a time capsule. I thought it was a fantastic book. So is there anyone else out there who has read this story? Are you familiar with it? Let me know. I hope everybody's having a great new year so far. I'm gonna get this uploaded probably tonight, so it will be ready for the first day of the new year. Say hi in the comments so I can come back and say hi to you on your own channel or page. And if you found anything of value in this video, please like and subscribe. I'm hoping to have a lot more fun and interesting content in 2024. Have a great day. Bye-bye.